Living in Europe for a year changes everything. From the moment you step off the plane, your perception of life, culture, and even yourself starts to evolve. Americans who take the leap often find themselves surprised by how much their new home differs from what they're used to. Today, we're unveiling the top 10 realizations Americans have after living in Europe. We've scoured the internet, forums, and testimonials to give you an honest summary of what life really looks like for Americans in Europe after a year. No sugarcoating here. We're pulling back the Instagram filter to show you the reality of living abroad. Before we dive into the list, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. 10. Life isn't all about work. For many Americans, one of the first things they notice is how differently Europeans approach work. While the US prides itself on a strong work ethic, with long hours often seen as a badge of honor, Europe takes a very different approach. In most European countries, there's a deep respect for personal time, and it's reflected in both policy and culture. For instance, in countries like Germany and France, labor laws ensure employees get significant time off. It's not just the 4 to 6 weeks of vacation many Europeans enjoy annually, it's also about the mindset. People truly disconnect during their breaks, something that feels almost impossible in the US. For many Americans, even a 1-week vacation comes with the constant urge to check emails or respond to work calls. Beyond vacation time, Europeans also value shorter work hours and more relaxed work environments. In the US, it's common for meetings to start early and drag on late into the evening, but in Europe, many workplaces respect boundaries. This difference extends to the rhythm of daily life. Lunch breaks in Europe can last an hour or more, allowing people to savor their meals and recharge. Compare this to the US, where a lunch break often means shoveling food at your desk while catching up on emails. For Americans adjusting to this slower pace, it's often a revelation. Some describe it as finally getting permission to breathe. It's not about laziness or doing less, it's about focusing on what truly matters. Quality time with family, hobbies, and simply enjoying life take precedence over the endless grind. 9. Safety feels different. The feeling of safety is another profound change that many Americans notice. For those who come from cities with high crime rates or are used to hearing daily reports of gun violence, the shift is almost immediate. In many European countries, there's a sense of calm that's hard to put into words. Walking down a quiet street at night doesn't feel like a gamble. Attending a festival or a public event doesn't come with the same underlying anxiety about potential violence. This is especially striking for Americans who grew up in areas where safety was a constant concern. For instance, someone moving from a major US city might describe the first few months in Europe as a period of adjustment, realizing they no longer have to be hyper-aware of their surroundings. This isn't to say that Europe is without crime. Petty theft, such as pickpocketing, can be a concern in tourist-heavy areas. However, violent crimes, particularly those involving firearms, are far less common. This stark contrast can feel like stepping into another world. Many Americans describe feeling an unexpected lightness, as though a weight they didn't even realize they were carrying has been lifted. For parents, the sense of safety is particularly meaningful. Allowing children to walk to school or play outside without constant supervision is often seen as a luxury in the US. In Europe, it's the norm. Streets in residential neighborhoods are filled with kids riding bikes, playing soccer, or simply hanging out, activities that might feel risky in certain parts of America. This newfound sense of security often comes as a relief, but it can also spark reflection. Many Americans find themselves wondering why safety feels so unattainable in their home country. While there are no easy answers, the contrast is a powerful reminder of how different societal priorities can shape daily life. 8. Healthcare that doesn't break the bank. One of the biggest shocks for Americans living in Europe is the cost and accessibility of healthcare. In the US, even with insurance, medical expenses can quickly spiral out of control. It's not uncommon for people to delay treatment or skip routine checkups entirely because they simply can't afford it. In Europe, the story is very different. Healthcare systems vary from country to country, but the underlying principle remains the same. Care should be affordable and accessible to all. For many Americans, the idea of walking into a doctor's office without worrying about the cost is almost unimaginable. Yet in Europe, it's the norm. Consider routine visits. In the US, a simple checkup can cost hundreds of dollars, even with insurance. In Europe, these visits are often free or come with a nominal fee. Prescription medications, which can be prohibitively expensive in the States, are heavily subsidized in many European countries. This makes it easier for people to manage chronic conditions or recover from illnesses without financial strain. Emergency care is another area where the differences are stark. In the US, a trip to the ER can lead to bills that stretch into the thousands, even for minor issues. In Europe, emergency treatment is far more affordable, and no one is turned away because they can't pay. This safety net provides a sense of security that many Americans find life-changing. It's not just about the financial side, though. The healthcare experience itself often feels more personal, Many Americans living in Europe describe doctors who take the time to listen, explain options, and build a rapport. This approach, combined with the financial accessibility, creates a healthcare system that feels less like a business and more like a public service. For Americans, adjusting to this new reality can be eye-opening. It's not uncommon to hear stories of people going to the doctor for the first time in years, simply because they can now afford it. This shift in perspective often leads to a deeper appreciation for the importance of accessible healthcare, not just as a convenience, but as a fundamental part of a well-functioning society. 7. Food feels more real. For many Americans, food in Europe is a game changer. The first bite of a fresh baguette, the taste of ripe produce, or the flavors of artisanal cheeses often sparks a question. Why doesn't food taste like this back home? The answer lies in Europe's approach to agriculture and food production. In Europe, there's a cultural emphasis on quality and freshness. Small farmers and local markets are a staple in many communities, providing seasonal produce and artisanal goods that haven't traveled thousands of miles to reach your plate. Even in supermarkets, the focus on minimal processing and fewer additives is evident. Many chemicals, preservatives, and genetically modified organisms, GMOs, that are commonplace in the US are banned or strictly regulated in Europe. Dining out highlights these differences even more. Whether it's a tiny trattoria in Italy or a neighborhood bistro in France, meals are often prepared from scratch using fresh ingredients. Even fast food tends to be of higher quality. The emphasis is less on speed and volume and more on flavor and authenticity. Americans living in Europe often marvel at how accessible healthy food is. In the US, eating well often feels like a privilege reserved for those with significant disposable income. Organic and farm-to-table options come at a premium, while highly processed, sugary, and calorie-dense foods are cheaper and more widely available. In Europe, fresh, wholesome food is the norm rather than the exception. The result? Many Americans report feeling healthier and more energized simply because of what they're eating. Over time, their palates adapt, and foods they once craved in the US may start to taste overly processed or artificial. This shift isn't just physical, it's also emotional. The act of savoring a meal, appreciating its origins, and connecting with others over food becomes a source of joy and connection. 6. Public transportation is a revelation. If there's one thing Americans living in Europe quickly fall in love with, it's the public transportation systems. Coming from a country where driving is often a necessity, the ease of getting around by train, tram, or bus feels like a luxury. European cities are built with public transit in mind. Metro systems in places like Paris, Berlin, and Madrid are extensive, reliable, and relatively affordable. Regional and high-speed trains connect towns and cities, making it possible to travel across entire countries or even borders without setting foot in a car. For Americans used to long road trips or expensive domestic flights, this interconnectedness is a revelation. The convenience of public transportation goes beyond practicality. It's also an environmental win. Many Europeans rely on trains and buses not just because they're easy to use, but because they reduce carbon footprints. For Americans, this often sparks reflection on the car-dependent culture of the US, where sprawling suburbs and limited transit options make owning a car almost mandatory. Another surprise for many Americans is how well-maintained and safe public transport systems tend to be. While there are exceptions, the cleanliness, efficiency, and frequency of European trains and buses often surpass expectations. It's not just about getting from point A to point B, it's about doing so comfortably and with minimal stress. For those who embrace this shift, the freedom from car ownership, no gas, no insurance, no parking headaches, is transformative. Walking more, cycling, or hopping on a train fosters a slower, more engaged way of life that many Americans come to cherish. 5. Multilingualism is the norm. One of the most humbling experiences for Americans in Europe is encountering people who speak multiple languages effortlessly. In many parts of Europe, it's not unusual to meet someone fluent in 3 or 4 languages. For Americans who often grow up with limited exposure to foreign languages, this can be both inspiring and intimidating. Language education starts early in Europe and is a key part of the school curriculum. Many children grow up learning their native language alongside English, French, German, or Spanish, depending on the region. By the time they reach adulthood, they're often conversational in at least 2 languages, if not more. For Americans living in Europe, this multilingualism highlights gaps in the U.S. education system. While some states emphasize language learning, it's rarely as comprehensive or immersive as in Europe. The result is a stark contrast. While many Europeans can switch seamlessly between languages, most Americans struggle to get beyond basic phrases. But it's not just about speaking multiple languages. It's about the cultural understanding that comes with it. Multilingual Europeans often have a broader perspective on history, politics, and global events, shaped by their ability to consume media and engage with people from different countries. For Americans, Americans, this can be both eye-opening and a call to action. Many start learning the local language as a way to integrate and show respect for their host country. Over time, they may even develop a deeper appreciation for the beauty and complexity of language itself. 4. Education feels more accessible. Education in Europe is another area that leaves many Americans in awe. For one, higher education in many European countries is either free or comes with minimal tuition fees. In places like Germany, Norway, and Sweden, international students can even access affordable education options, provided they meet certain criteria. This accessibility is in stark contrast to the US, where student debt is a significant burden for millions. For many Americans living in Europe, the idea that young people can pursue their passions without the looming fear of debt feels revolutionary. It allows students to explore different fields of study or change majors without financial repercussions. But it's not just about universities. Primary and secondary education in Europe often takes a more holistic approach. Students are exposed to arts, music, and languages alongside traditional academic subjects. Vocational training is also more widely accepted and respected, offering pathways for students who prefer hands-on careers. For Americans raising children in Europe, the education system is often a pleasant surprise. Schools emphasize critical thinking, creativity, and global awareness, preparing students not just for exams, but for life. This well-rounded approach fosters a sense of curiosity and engagement that many American parents find refreshing. 3. A slower, more deliberate pace of life. For many Americans, the fast-paced, efficiency-driven culture of the US is second nature. Days are filled with packed schedules, multitasking, and constant connectivity. Moving to Europe, however, can feel like stepping into a different world, one where life flows at a more deliberate pace. Europeans often take time to enjoy the small things. A coffee isn't just a quick caffeine boost. It's an opportunity to sit at a cafe, chat with friends, or people watch. Meals are savored rather than rushed, with family dinners lasting hours and lunch breaks often spent at home or with coworkers at a nearby restaurant. This shift in priorities can feel disorienting at first for Americans, but over time, it becomes a welcome change. In many European countries, Sundays are still treated as a day of rest. Shops close, streets quiet down, and families come together for long meals or outings. It's a stark contrast to the US, where weekends are often packed with errands, sports practices, and social commitments. For Americans adjusting to this slower pace, the experience is both calming and transformative. It's not about doing less, it's about being more present. 2. A new perspective on community and connection. Americans living in Europe often find that community plays a much larger role in daily life. From bustling local markets to lively town squares, there's a sense of togetherness that can feel different from the more individualistic culture of the US. In small towns and big cities alike, Europeans prioritize relationships and social bonds. Neighbors often know each other by name, and it's common to see people gathering at local pubs, cafes, or parks to catch up and share stories. Even in urban environments, there's a sense of connection, whether it's the local baker greeting regular customers or a friendly chat with a fellow commuter on the tram. This focus on community extends to how public spaces are designed. In many European cities, parks, squares, and pedestrian zones are intentionally created to encourage interaction and relaxation. Americans often find themselves spending more time outdoors, whether it's joining a community event, picnicking in the park, or simply strolling through historic streets. For those coming from the US, where suburban sprawl and car culture can limit face-to-face interactions, this emphasis on community feels refreshing. It fosters a sense of belonging that many find deeply fulfilling. Over time, this focus on connection can even reshape how Americans approach relationships, encouraging them to slow down and invest more time in the people around them. 1. Gratitude for the US and a bit of culture shock. After a year in Europe, many Americans develop a newfound appreciation for their home country. While there's plenty to admire about European life, living abroad also highlights the unique aspects of American culture that expats might miss. For example, the entrepreneurial spirit in the US is hard to replicate. Many Americans appreciate how their home country encourages innovation and rewards ambition. In Europe, where societal systems prioritize stability and tradition, the concept of dreaming big can sometimes feel less emphasized. At the same time, Americans often experience moments of culture shock when returning home. The sheer size of portions at restaurants, the prevalence of big box stores, and the non-stop consumer advertising can feel overwhelming after a year in Europe. Even something as simple as tipping culture can take time to readjust to, as many Europeans include service charges in their bills. Ultimately, living in Europe doesn't just change how Americans see the world, it changes how they see themselves. The experience fosters personal growth, adaptability, and a broader perspective on what truly matters in life. So, there you have it, the top 10 ways Americans feel after living in Europe for a year. It's a journey filled with challenges, surprises, and profound profound realizations. Living abroad isn't just about exploring a new place, it's about rediscovering yourself and reevaluating your values. What about you? Have you lived abroad or considered making the move? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this. Your experiences might help someone else make the right decision.